It's a real pleasure to introduce this event, Saving the Union, Whitehall and the Scottish Independence Referendum. It's the 10th anniversary this month, of course. And we are very lucky to have as our speaker, Philip Rycroft. He's a distinguished honorary researcher at the Bennett Institute. He's been involved in our work on governance and the Constitution. He was a former permanent secretary at the Department for Exiting the EU. And the discussion afterwards is going to be chaired by Peter Geoghegan, journalist, broadcaster, author of The People's Referendum, Why Scotland Will Never Be the Same Again. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Peter to take you into the evening proper. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thanks all of you for coming, and thanks everybody who's tuning in online. And as Diane says, I was really struck. It's the 10th anniversary of Scottish Independence Referendum. Mike Kenny very kindly asked me to do this a few months ago. I was delighted to say yes. And I did think there'd be a lot of conversation in the 10-year celebration of Scottish Independence Referendum, or an anniversary thinking about it. I was very lucky. I was a journalist at the time. I was living in Scotland. I was working for just about every non-UK news title you can imagine, from the Irish Times, the Washington Post, and everybody else in between, covering the referendum. And I found it a really interesting experience, and I was really kind of excited to think about it. And I feel like the closer we've got to the 10th anniversary of the referendum, I've been actually struck by how little conversation really has been on it. I must confess, I realised I didn't actually have a copy of my own book, which shows how engaged I've been with the debate recently. I had to buy it online. There's still some copies which I was pleased to find, or maybe not, depending. And outside of the Scottish press, there was very little conversation about this. I was really struck with it. The Scottish press, unsurprisingly, had a lot of kind of interesting pieces about what it meant 10 years on. Kenny Farquharson, who used to be at the Scotsman, had a great actually piece in his Substack, which is worth reading, looking at, he wrote Scotland on Sundays leader column in the days up to the referendum, and he's kind of unpicking it and asking what would he do now. And two things struck me. One was this importance as a journalist of the Scottish press 10 years ago, which is definitely not what it was, but also the conversation that wasn't happening in the rest of the UK. Certainly I didn't feel, I now live in London, I didn't feel like it was a conversation that was happening in England at all. And that's something I'd love to think a bit about as we have this discussion. And it's one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here with Philip Rycroft, as well as managing so much of the Brexit process in DexEU, was also, as he talked about himself, came out of having left the civil service, was brought back in. I got the sense of, I guess it wasn't just when he taught me, just I thought it was out, they brought me back in. It wasn't just for Brexit, he also did it for the Scottish Independence Referendum before that. So without further ado, Philip's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then I'll ask him some questions of conversation. Then I'm going to go out to the audience, both online and here in the auditorium. So be thinking of questions, and hopefully we should have a pretty interesting debate. And even if there's not been as much conversation as we'd like about this, now is an opportunity, hopefully, to correct some of that. Take it away, Philip.
Thanks very much, Peter. I do recommend this book, by the way. I read it recently, and this is sort of a reminder of how that campaign was. It's a really very distinct moment in British history, and it captures the moment really well. Very interesting. I will give it absolutely give it a plug. I enjoyed it a lot. And thank you, Peter, for comparing tonight. Thank you to the Bennett Institute team for having me along. So, as Peter said, I have a talk here which should be about 35 minutes if I don't get distracted en route, which I'll try not to. It's now, as Dan said, it is 10 years since the referendum. So just over 10 years ago, at about 2:30 in the morning of Friday, the 19th of September 2014, I was sat on my own in the back of a taxi heading from the referendum count at Ingliston on the outskirts of Edinburgh, heading to Melville Crescent, the home of the Scotland office in the city's West End. My diary records the moment, 20 minutes or so in the taxi in peace, a quiet contemplation of a job well done. We've done it. Although the count was far from complete, it was clear by that time of the night that no note independence was well ahead. The people of Scotland had rejected the proposition that Scotland should become an independent country. But it had been a long and bruising journey to that point. The UK government had ceded the possibility of a referendum in the immediate aftermath of the SNP's surprise winning of a majority in the Scottish parliamentary elections of May 2011. It had done so without much of a clue as to what that concession might entail, but reassured by polling which showed support for independence not much higher than 30%. That complacency was sorely tested as Whitehall struggled to deal with what by the end of the campaign had become a very real threat to the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. So this short talk this evening examines how Whitehall responded to the challenge posed by the referendum. That you are here or listening online, and thank you very much for coming along, suggests, hopefully, that you would agree that this is of more than passing interest, that our understanding of those events over a decade ago is important to our understanding of the nature of the British state and the way it functions and to its possible futures. That is certainly my contention, though the very muted reactions Peter has already described to the 10th anniversary of the referendum might indicate that it is a view not necessarily widely shared. Obscured now by Brexit and COVID, the experience of the referendum no longer resonates as it did in its immediate aftermath. With the nationalist cause foundering and the prospects of another referendum receding over a foreseeable horizon, there are objective reasons for the British state not to particularly prioritise matters relating to the Union. There are more pressing concerns. That, I'm afraid, is a default, as was long the case. The territorially peripheral is treated as politically peripheral. It was very different in 2014, and I want to tell the story this evening of how the British state responded to something which it initiated, but for which it was fundamentally unprepared. I will draw some conclusions about what that says about the nature of the British state. But that can't be the end of it. For what if the nationalist moment comes again? I make no predictions other than to posit that the way the British state is and has its being makes it more than likely that it will encounter the next existential threat from the north almost as unprepared as it was in 2014. Moreover, the fact of the referendum in 2014 inevitably changes the zone of possibility for dealing with a resurgent nationalism. A campaign like that of 2012 to 2014 cannot be fought again. Next time, those seeking to preserve the Union will start on the back foot. Perhaps we really should be paying more attention. But that's to share too much of my punchline up front. Before I dive in, a quick word about my role in all of this. In May 2011, I was safely ensconced as a very much ex-civil servant in the private sector. As much to my own surprise as anyone else's, I found myself in May 2012 back close to the heart of the beast as the Director General in charge of the civil service side of the office of the then Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government, Nick Clegg. In and amongst a wide-ranging brief came responsibility for matters constitutional and hence the key role in Whitehall engagement in the Scottish referendum campaign. That I had worked for 20 or so years as a civil servant in Scotland and indeed lived in Scotland was entirely serendipitous. And that in its own small way says something about the story I will now tell you. So the winning of a majority by the SNP in the Scottish Parliament elections of May 2011 came as a shock to most commentators. The polls had only latterly indicated that such a result might be on the cards, and in the event, the SNP outperformed the polls. This was an electoral system that had been designed partly to prevent such an eventuality, and there had been very little speculation, north or south, about what a nationalist majority might entail. The SNP manifesto had included, albeit in a relatively ritualistic way, a commitment to a referendum on independence. That is what prompted the Prime Minister, David Cameron, to concede the possibility of holding such a referendum, which he did on the morning after the election, with the support of his Liberal Democrat coalition partners. This was, in retrospect, an extraordinary constitutional moment. The UK government had taken itself into uncharted territory, and in so doing had accepted the possibility of the breakup of the United Kingdom. What followed was a rather drawn-out process of retrofitting some semblance of order on that hasty decision. Previous referendums, including the border poll in Northern Ireland in 1973, had done little to prepare Whitehall for the pitching of the UK government against a democratically elected government of part of its territory in an existential struggle for the future of the country. Even the legal position on the authorising of a referendum was unclear, or at least disputed by the Scottish Government, which had long insisted that some sort of advisory referendum was legally possible under the powers of the Scottish Parliament. While the Scottish Government persisted in its view, advice from the Advocate General for Scotland, Jim Wallace, one of the UK's government's two law officers, in the autumn of 2011, made it unequivocally clear to ministers that it was only Westminster that could authorise a referendum. This understanding crystallised into a decision to promote a Section 30 order under the Scotland Act, whereby Westminster would give the Scottish Parliament temporary powers to put in place legislation to enable a referendum. This would be a referendum made in Scotland, and it would be, in the strap line now promoted by the UK government, one that would be fair, legal and decisive. Having decided to take the course of the Section 30 order, the UK government now set out to negotiate its terms with the Scottish Government. This too was an unusual spectacle. The government of the whole of the UK negotiating with a devolved government on how a referendum could be held that might herald the end of the United Kingdom. This was also a protracted process, not hastened by the Havering. He too could read the polls on support for independence, or more charitably, the hedging of his bets by Alex Salmond, who clung tenaciously to the option to make this a two-question referendum with Devo Max as the third alternative to status quo or independence. Incidentally, looking back with hindsight, maybe the UK government should have accepted that. Anyway, we come on to that in questions. This became the rock on which the UK government was prepared to crash the process. It would concede control to the Scottish Government on most of the other pertinent issues, including setting of the question, the franchise, and crucially, the timing. But one question only it had to be, with a coda. The Section 30 order was a one-shot concession. Its authority expired at the end of 2014. With the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement in October 2012, the UK government was now engaged in a contest to save the Union. It would not be neutral in this endeavour, nor would its civil service. The same applied to the Scottish Government and the civil servants who worked for it. Guidance produced by the then Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, effectively sanctioned civil service involvement, but could not dictate how that would be managed through the twists and turns of a vibrant and at the margins bitter referendum campaign. Whitehall was completely unprepared for what lay ahead. The departments on the front line was one of Whitehall's smallest and least influential, the Scotland Office. Understanding of Scottish politics and even the devolution settlements was elsewhere at best sketchy, even in the Cabinet Office. And this referendum, in contrast to previous experience, would draw Whitehall deeper into the campaign than anyone had anticipated. The instinctive Whitehall response was to organise its work on the referendum through a series of committees: the Scotland Committee, which was a formal cabinet committee, a committee chaired by the Secretary of State for Scotland, which brought together the key departments, Scotland Office, Treasury, Cabinet Office, number 10, and a cross-departmental senior officials group, which I chaired. But coordinating a cross-government effort proved a lot tougher than creating committees. There was the usual institutional tension, sometimes exacerbated by cross-coalition nippiness, and occasional freelancing by errant ministers, as when one anonymous ministerial source promised The Guardian that the UK would trade Scotland staying in a currency union for continued access to Faslane. And as you all know, what's based at Faslane, the UK's nuclear deterrence is quite important. A more significant issue was simply that this was not on the priority list for most departments. Ministers and senior officials were briefed from time to time. The devolution teams within departments laboured mightily to produce text and evidence when required, but in a long tradition of benign neglect when it came to territorial governance, for the most part, across Whitehall, this was largely seen as a problem for someone else to manage. There is an assumption in some contemporary accounts that the might of the Whitehall machine cranked into gear to confront the challenge posed by the referendum. In fact, the resource dedicated to the effort was remarkably modest, comprising mainly the Scotland office and small teams in the Cabinet Office number 10 in the Treasury. Even I, ostensibly the senior official leading on this in Whitehall, had much else on my hands. My day job was advising the Deputy Prime Minister on everything else that was going on in government. Nevertheless, a plan emerged. At the core of this was an assumed division of labour between the UK governments and Better Together, the cross-party campaign for No, led by Alistair Darling. The government would fight the air war, providing the hard-edged economic and other data to demonstrate why staying in the UK was a better option for Scotland. Meanwhile, Better Together would fight the ground war, taking the campaign onto the streets across Scotland. This led to the Scotland Analysis publications, a series of documents published over several months that made the case for the first time ever for the Union across a wide range of policy areas. Three arguments were central: that an independent Scotland would not be part of a currency union, would remain the UK, that there was no guarantee that an independent Scotland would be able to become a member of the EU, ironically, and that Scotland would lose a public spending dividend equating to around £1,400 per head of population. Although couched in positive best of both worlds language, the description of the downside risks of independence inevitably became tarred with the project fear brush. By late 2013, well into the campaign, it was becoming clear that the original strategy was no longer fit for purpose. Better Together was struggling to make an impact in the face of a vibrant and multifaceted Yes campaign. The polls were beginning to shift in favour of Yes. The pressure was on the UK government to come off the high ground and get more involved in the actual campaign. The upshot was much more direct outreach, including 2 so-called door drops leaflets setting out the benefits of the UK that the UK government sent to every household in Scotland, thereby shredding my nerves, apart from anything else, as we've signed those off. Needless to say, this activity took us right up to the boundary of civil service propriety. My diary records a series of battles to persuade Jeremy Haywood that what we were doing was both necessary and proper. Part of this more proactive approach entailed enlisting support from influential external players, or at least capitalising on comments they made, as well as comments from a variety of business leaders. At various moments, the words of Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy, Commission President Barroso, US President Obama, J.K. Rowling, Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, David Bowie, and even the Pope were praying in aid by UK government ministers. And of course, the Queen made her elliptical remarks outside Cruffy Kirk a few days before the actual vote, where she expressed the hope to a bystander that voters would think very carefully about the future. The UK government could claim that it had the great and good on side. What was more notable was the relative lack of a popular emotional spark from south of the border. Polling suggested that only about a fifth of people in England were actually in favour of Scottish independence, quite a lot, wanted to see the back of Scotland, but the concerns of the wider majority never turned into the sort of groundswell that led to the unity rally a few days before the second Quebec referendum in 1995. This was symptomatic of a wider problem facing the UK government's engagement in the campaign, the difficulty of making the emotional case for the Union. While David Cameron made a few well-regarded speeches and appealed to a long shared history, and former Prime Minister Gordon Brown found his range in a couple of barnstorming interventions near the end of the campaign, for the most part, the UK government's case to the people of Scotland was an appeal to the head rather than the heart. Prompted by a poll on in the Sunday Times on the 8th of September 2014 that showed yes, 1 point ahead, the leaders of the three main UK parties committed themselves to the vow, a promise of further powers for Scotland if the vote should be to remain in the UK. Orchestrated by Gordon Brown, the vow was credited at the time with helping to turn the tide that had been surging in favour of yes. While in practice it probably did not swing many votes, it was undeniably a morale boost for a no campaign whose nerves were becoming increasingly ragged. David Cameron had made an unspecific commitment to further powers in a speech as early as February 2012. Why had it taken so long for this to crystallise into the proposition encapsulated in the vow? It was not for lack of prompting. At various moments over the months, officials had sought permission to work on the options for further devolution, only to be put on hold. With the Scotland Bill heading through Parliament, which implemented the Calman Commission recommendations, and three separate commissions set up by each of the main UK parties, there was simply no appetite within the coalition to forego possible political advantage by seeking to agree a common position until under extreme pressure towards the end of the campaign. A similar fate befell the Mackay Commission on the West Lothian question, the issue of MPs from Scotland voting on English issues in Westminster. So at lunchtime on referendum day, my diary records that I was sitting in an office at the Green Investment Bank in Edinburgh, discussing with Lord Robert Smith his conditions for leading what became known as the Smith Commission on further devolution for Scotland, designed to meet the commitments made in the vow. On the morning after the referendum, David Cameron stood on the steps of number 10 to make a commitment to introduce English votes for English laws. So the scene was set for the making of the post-referendum constitutional order. The process was far from smooth. My diary notes on the 25th of November 2014, world gone slightly crazy. As DPM said coming out of cabinet, you couldn't make it up. Bizarre even for the thick of it. Changing the nature of the UK through a cobbled together process which no one controls and no one really understands, and doing it under a ludicrous timescale. Nevertheless, the vow was delivered on time through the Scotland Act 2016. The Wales Act 2017 was designed to set the Welsh devolution settlement on a similarly stable footing. English votes for English laws was meant to salve irritated English opinion. Altogether, this, it was hoped, would tidy up Labour's settlement from 1999 and put arguments about the UK's future to rest. It didn't quite turn out like that, of course. The referendum was anything but decisive, in the opinion of many people in Scotland, who registered their disappointment in the outcome by electing the SNP to 56 of Scotland's 59 constituencies in the general election of May 2015. With a surge in SNP party membership and continued dominance of domestic politics in Scotland in a strange reversal of roles, it was the losers in the referendum who behaved like they'd won the argument. But for Whitehall, the job was done. After a brief moment of anxiety as the polls tightened towards the end of the campaign, territorial governance could resume its normal place in the grand hierarchy of things as a specialist subject for a few and an afterthought for the many. And then, of course, came Brexit, which washed away any short-term semblance of constitutional certainty. So what does this story tell us about the nature of the British state? It's worth reflecting on the decision that set the whole process in motion. There was no constitutional requirement for the UK government to agree to the holding of a referendum after the 2011 Scottish parliamentary elections. The SNP had won a majority, but with under 50% of the vote in both constituency vote and regional lists, and on a turnout barely above 50%, there was nothing to suggest that support for independence was anywhere near a critical level. The UK government would have been well within its rights to have noted the results, to sought to muddy the outcome by accusing the SNP of obscuring the demand for a referendum in its manifesto among a welter of other issues, and to have moved on. That it did not, that the coalition leadership took an early decision to respect the outcome of the election was an admirable statement of democratic principle, albeit caveated by the political calculation that enabling a referendum when support for independence was so low would likely kill off the issue for a generation. There were very few other polities around the globe where the parties of the dominant centre would have been prepared to make such a concession. This spoke to the pragmatic tradition of the British Constitution and the capacity of the central political elite to respond to potential stress on the body politic. In like manner, the British state showed flexibility and some ingenuity in manoeuvring through an unprecedented constitutional situation to reach agreements on a way forward that was broadly acceptable in both Scotland and the wider UK, and without any hint of violence or bloodshed. This was a signal achievement. But the circumstances in which this was done speak volumes about the construct that is the British state and about its character. Most obviously, there was no written constitution to guide the hand of ministers. There was nothing in statute that delineated a lawful path to secession, or indeed that explicitly excluded such a possibility. The decision to make the referendum possible was taken by a handful of individuals at the centre of the UK government. This was a stark illustration of the power of the executive in the British state, able to initiate a process that might have led to the secession of Scotland, and to do so initially without reference to Parliament. The legislature was asked to approve the Section 30 order that put the legality of the referendum beyond doubt, but it did so only after close on 2 years of public debate and established a public expectation that a referendum would happen. With no constitutional guide rails and little active intervention from Parliament, it was up to the same small group of actors who had initiated the referendum process to determine its conditionalities. This was from its outset a politically driven and fundamentally ad hoc process. Prior to May 2011, no one within the state apparatus had been commissioned to work up options for ministers in the event of an SNP majority. The Whitehall Civil Service had not thought it necessary to undertake such work at its own hand. Whether it even had the capability is doubtful. It was simply not resourced to do other than keep a watching brief on the state of the devolution settlements and to service the rather desultory exercise of the intergovernmental machinery. The civil service did not see that it had any role to imagine different possible political futures, and so had no way of thinking to draw on once the prospect of a referendum was thrust on it. The situation was unprecedented in modern times, and a generous reading of the Whitehall engagement in the referendum would highlight the agility that saw a rapid evolution of tactics in response to the twists and turns of the campaign in Scotland. This took civil service actors very close to the boundaries of what in normal course would be considered proper in terms of interaction with a political campaign. The Whitehall system went into this endeavour from a base of comparatively weak constitutional understanding and responded with some ingenuity to what was thrown at it. To be clear, this was not an enterprise led by experts. As with so much of policy making in Whitehall, those of us involved in this work might uncharitably be described as gifted amateurs learning as we went along. Moreover, this was an exercise that engaged relatively few across Whitehall. In contrast to our counterparts in Scotland, very few Whitehall civil servants had a personal dog in this fight. This reinforced, what I mean by that, they didn't live in Scotland, they had brothers in Scotland, they did not have a personal commitment in this issue. This reinforced the Whitehall tendency to see the referendum as someone else's issue. There was nothing like a general mobilisation across the governing centre. Departments largely did what was asked of them in terms of producing material from Scotland analysis series. Some ministers ventured north of the border, message discipline mostly held, but the way in which Whitehall dealt with this campaign was much in keeping with the long tradition of territorial governance in the UK. The attention of the centre was held briefly when it faced an existential threat as the polls tightened towards the end of the campaign, but slipped away rapidly in the aftermath. Territorial governance remained for most, at best, a distraction, and the British state was quick to forget. When I and colleagues were invited to brief permanent secretaries, the slightly oddly named Wednesday morning colleagues meeting on constitutional issues in March 2015, Jeremy Hayward introduced the item as being incredibly dull. This is the same Jeremy Hayward who, on another occasion when he'd just given me another job to do, said Philip gets all the shit jobs. and this was before he sent me off to the Department for Excellent English. Also, as my diary records, in the recounting of the lists of achievement of the coalition government in the last cabinet meeting on 24th March 2015, there was no mention of the Scottish referendum. And it took an intervention by Alistair Carmichael, then Secretary of State for Scotland, to correct that, though in fairness that did prompt a clatter of table banging. This amnesia is reflected too in the failure to learn the lessons of the Scottish campaign. There was no appetite for retrospective analysis of what had worked and what had not. With hindsight, this was careless. Some of the tropes of the Yes campaign were echoed by the Leave side in the EU referendum. It is arguable that the Scottish campaign heard the first blasts of the populist trumpet, which worked to such good effect for Leave. A more reflective centre might have pondered on its experience of the Scottish campaign in its approach to the EU referendum. But the British state doesn't really do self-reflection. All of that is 10 years ago now. With the story of the Scottish referendum, while the story of the Scottish referendum might be of historical interest, what is the contemporary relevance? After all, despite the twists and turns, the campaign was one for the Union. Moreover, the wheel of political fortune has swung decisively against the nationalist cause in Scotland. The SNP is beset by travails, most of its own making. It has been deserted by many voters, and the prospects of another independent referendum anytime soon are close to zero. And yet, the fact of the referendum in 2014 remains a significant feature on the constitutional landscape. A question once asked cannot be unasked. What was almost imaginable when I moved to Scotland over 35 years ago is now something which many Scots thought was within their grasp, and if the polls are to believe, a majority have at one time or another contemplated as a desirable future. The course of the campaign revealed the extent to which the terms of the Union have changed in preceding decades. While it's a bit hard to credit the 2013 poll that suggested that a majority of Scots would trade their vote for a £500 mess of pottage, nevertheless the No campaign found that there were thin pickings in an emotional appeal. The head mattered more than the heart, and that remains the case today. The allure of empire clearly is long gone, and British exceptionalism has been tarnished by a botched Brexit. The welfare state is a workaday affair of contestation about the generosity of benefits, not the beacon of hope it once was. The BBC, the monarchy, the armed forces, no institution can ride quite high enough to trump Scottish national pride. Brexit no doubt makes Scottish independence more complicated, and current international tensions underline the benefits of common defence. But neither are factors which will rekindle an emotional attachment to the Union. Are there any hints in the referendum story about the capacity of the British state to deal with that reality? Perhaps three. Firstly, it is highly unlikely that this or any foreseeable government will seek to preempt the future through radical change to the constitution by revisiting the Devo Max possibilities that once beguiled a majority of those polled about Scotland's governance. Pragmatism and an ad hoc approach were seen to have worked well enough to date and managed an existential risk in 2014. The British state is not reflective, and not being reflective cannot imagine itself into different futures. It will remain reactive. Secondly, Whitehall will be almost as unprepared for any future shock as it was in 2011. This is no criticism of those who have laboured mightily to improve the understanding of devolution and of territorial politics within the Whitehall system. This work continues to be necessary and will, on a day-to-day basis, mitigate the Whitehall tendency to forget to deal with the devolved consequences. But this will remain a fringe preoccupation. The default is to slide back into a metropolitan mindset that regards the periphery as, well, peripheral. Thirdly, the referendum experience and what has followed has left the Union in a more brittle state than it was before. As the campaign revealed, the Union now functions on a more transactional basis. The UK government expended a good deal of capital in seeking to buttress that transaction, not least on the argument that remaining in the UK was the best way of securing Scotland's future in the EU. In a world where the concept of independence is normalised, the patch of ground from which to defend the Union has narrowed. None of that matters too much, of course, unless there is a prospect of another referendum. As the allure of nationalism fades in the moment, the benefits of the transactional union remain visibly powerful and will be further strengthened if the British state is successful, finally, in its endeavour to engender economic prosperity and robust regional governance in England outside of London and the South East. The Union will continue to be underpinned by the economic and security synergies that will always be a factor on these islands. That makes the Union in some eyes a natural and a necessary one, and so it may prove for an indeterminate future. But there is another side to the necessary Union coin. It requires the dominant centre to be cognizant of the pressures its own dominance brings. In other words, it requires governance by natural unionists. That failed for Ireland in the early 20th century. It was challenged again in the 1980s and by Brexit for the three devolved parts of the UK, most vividly illustrated by the close to contemptuous treatment of Northern Ireland throughout the Brexit process. There is now a powerful strain of thinking in one of the major UK parties that sets little store by peripheral sensibilities in the pursuit of its own agenda. That is the wild card that makes the cross-UK party alignment that more or less held through the 2014 campaign almost inconceivable. If a future government dominated by such ideology sought to bend the Union to its purpose, the experience of the referendum of 2014 means that people in Scotland know they have another possible future. At about 5 o'clock in the morning of Friday, 19 September 2014, I got a text from my oldest son. He's an iconic mix of Scots and Yorkshire, and he's not effusive. The text read simply, "Thank God for that, well done." Those few words almost broke the emotional reticence that I've sought to hold as a servant of the Crown through that long campaign, for it had been a gruelling personal as well as a professional odyssey. I wonder how it will feel for whoever is in my boots if and when this comes round again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Philip. What a fascinating talk, bringing us both back to that moment, but also casting forward into where we are, what comes next. I guess I might start by bringing it back and maybe move into the forward as we speak a bit more. But you paint a picture there of a Whitehall that was kind of ill prepared for the referendum, of politicians who struggled to make an emotional or a kind of a hard case for the union. And you also kind of talked a little about what happened later with Brexit and how the Yes campaign kind of presaged some of that, some of the narratives from the Yes campaign. I guess the thing that kind of strikes you now looking back is knowing what you know next. Britain voted for Brexit, America voted for Trump. We saw a lot of, it's a politics reaction which is still roiling across the world, really. I kind of feel it sounds like a strange thing to ask, but why did the Yes campaign not win?
it's a very good question, and there's a brilliant picture of Alex Salmon after the results had come in, and you remember this, in a car going Edinburgh to Aberdeen Airport, looking completely shattered. They thought they'd won. Their polling company, their news had said that they were ahead. The other thing that happened on this, of course, is the timing question proved to be absolutely critical. So David Cameron, in a very loose David Cameron sort of moment, sort of conceded the time. There was a sort of reception for journalists in Dover House, which was the home of Scotland Office in Whitehall. And he said, of course, the Scottish government will determine the time. So Salmon ran a long campaign because he was the insurgent and he needed the time to build up support for independence. And we saw that process. I remember we were doing polling pretty much all the way through. By the end, day by day, broken down by gender, by age, by geography, and watching those yes numbers climb all the way across Scotland filled a lot of us with a great deal of anxiety. If that campaign had carried on for another 3 or 4 months, who knows what would have happened? But I think the counterfactual in your question is if people in Scotland could have seen what lay ahead, then I think the vote would have been different. The outcome would have been different. In particular, if they'd seen what came with Brexit. Let's not forget, people in Scotland voted pretty decisively to stay in the EU. And just in parenthesis, that decision to take Scotland on the to take the UK out of the EU sort of broke the deal about Scotland's place in the Union, and that sort of assumption that the centre would always respect the major issues that concern people of Scotland, indeed Wales, Northern Ireland as well. So it was a closer run thing than any of us anticipated at the start. Alex Salmon ran a very successful campaign, very populist in many ways, and he came within a whisker. And just finally on this question, what swung it at the end? I remember lying on a couch in the Social States room in Melville Crescent, Scotland Office in Edinburgh, about 8 o'clock on referendum day in the evening, trying to get that sleep because I'm going to be up all night. And we just had the exit polls out. We knew not how people voted, but we knew what the turnout was. And we knew the turnout was exceptionally high, 85, 86%, but we didn't know where it was high. And whether it was in Glasgow and Dundee or whether it was in the leafy suburbs. And it turned out it was very, very high in the leafy suburbs. And what happened is people who were worried about their economic future had turned out in larger numbers than in the schemes around Glasgow and Dundee. And that's really what won it for the Union.
And so there's a bit of a corollary actually to that question, I guess, but listening to you there talking about English votes for English laws, I'm actually myself kind of parachuted back into the 19th of September. The result comes out, Cameron makes this speech about English votes for English laws. And then he then goes on, wins an election and has the Brexit referendum. I guess, and Cameron does come up in you like, without pinning it on one person, but how much of it was kind of symptomatic of a political party that didn't really engage with the union as a serious issue, even despite having it in its name?
I think David Cameron himself was very personally committed to them. No doubt about that. If you read his speeches that he made through the 2012, 2013, 2014, they were actually very well regarded. And he knew fine well that as a Conservative Prime Minister, he couldn't carry this argument on his own in Scotland because his brand was unpopular in Scotland. Hence, Alistair Darling, former Labour Chancellor, leading the Better Together campaign. So David Cameron, I think, did what he could in terms of his own personal commitments to this. But I think what he and to St George Osborne learned from the Scottish, they learned the wrong lessons from the Scottish referendum campaign. Partly, Cameron was a risk taker, or is still a risk taker. And he took the big risks of the Scottish referendum. It worked out for him. And I think looking at the success of that, he thought he could pull that same trick again with the EU referendum. But there are two things I think that he didn't work. And this is where why didn't you do that deeper analysis? One, on timing. He thought the mistake he'd made in 2012 was to allow a long campaign. And so if you remember, the Brexit campaign was very foreshort, it was a very short campaign. What he hadn't worked out was he needed time to build the case for the EU, because he was the insurgent in that campaign. A lot of the opinion polls I think people now think were not accurate when it said Remain was ahead. So he'd got the wrong learning from that campaign. And the other thing that I think they didn't learn properly was this whole thing about Project Fear. They thought it was Project Fear that won it in Scotland. But everything we wrote was the pound works for Scotland. Being in a trading relationship with the UK works for Scotland. Being in the UK works for you staying in the EU. Defence works. So all of the argument was a positive one. This is the best of both worlds. But, by the way, if you come out, the other side of that coin is that Scotland will lose out. Of course, we have to say that. But what they saw was the thinking, it was just that side of the argument that persuaded folk. And hence the EU campaign is very interesting. If you look at what the UK government had pitched itself in both campaigns, the EU campaign was relentlessly negative. And Cameron and Osborne were not prepared to make the positive case for the EU. And that's where I think, this is extraordinary that they've had this live sort of dry run, if you like, of the other campaign. And they didn't do the learning from it. Just one, I think it's almost like there was an urge to forget. It was almost like they're embarrassed by having embarked on this thing. And this is again in my diary, which I haven't published yet. Might never be. But I remember asking Pastor, well, are we going to get some sort of marking of the fact that this team has worked its socks off to achieve this result? Not a lot of us, but there's a lot of officials who made this immense commitment to saving the union, and the answer came out no. So I had to organise the thank you party. I did get a bit of support from like Danny Alexander and the other ministers, but it was like symptomatic to me of the sort of this. Well, we've done this, but we're a bit embarrassed by it, and we don't really want to be associated with it.
Thanks, Philip. I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist if I didn't hear you speak there and talk about how close at times you came to the civil service boundaries and the kind of issues around all of that, and just ask you to expand a bit more on some of those things. That kind of this conversation with Jeremy Haywood and what was going on, what was happening, what kind of things you're talking about there, and how you felt about it.
So things so that what the state was doing, like civil service meant to stay out of political campaigns. It's one of the the foundational rules about impartiality and all the rest of it. And yet we became deeply involved in this campaign. We had some very brilliant special advisors in number 10 who managed the interface of the campaign. So I didn't have to go and sit in the room with Al Stein, but other people, but there was a very live feed, if you like, from, and indeed one or two former colleagues, civil servants who were also involved in that. We sort of could have those conversations without crossing that line. But on other stuff, I remember big rows about polling. The government doesn't do political polling, but we ended up with one of the polling companies, as I say, towards the end, daily polling. I mean, this was expensive, and I had dozens, maybe exaggerate, I had a lot of FOI requests after the event. How much did you spend on polling? Which for about 2 or 3 years was using some of the exemptions under FOI to push on. So I remember having big debates with that about, the folk who sat around Jeremy running propriety and ethics, and some of you know those individuals won't know any names. But the other thing was these household door drops. We were producing literature which was going literally to every household in Scotland. And, Jeremy Haywood had absolute kittens about this stuff, in case there's something in it that was wrong, was inaccurate. And there's another story I'll tell you, which isn't public domain, but a little bit hidden. In the first door drop, we went through that thing. I knew the whole thing off by heart. But when I signed it off to go to printers, 2.5 million copies of this bloody thing. And then the printed copy came in, and somebody said, you can see letters on the plumber's van. There was a picture of a plumber's van, and when we saw the proof of it, it was slightly blurry, and you couldn't read the letters on the van. But when you saw it printed, it was like PK plumbers or something. And somebody said we better look up how many PK plumbers are out of Scotland, and there were 4 or 5 of them, and we couldn't put the thing out. So I had to go to Daniel. I remember sitting in Daniel Alexander's Chief Secretary, Treasury, the lead got on this, Steve in Scotland. He said, what are we going to do for it? We have no alternative to pulp it. So we sent 2.5 million copies. I have probably the sole remaining copy of this leaflet in my attic. 2.5 million went off to be pulped. And that was a moment when, I had to fess up to my boss and to Chairman because I'd wasted like £100,000, probably whatever it was. And it was one of those career defining possibly moments. So I was a wee bit nervous about all that. But we got it back on track. And you have to book the Royal Mail like months in advance to do these things because they don't have like. But anyway, they managed to do it within 2 weeks. We got the thing reprinted and off it went. But I had a lot of hair at the start of this thing. Anyway, that was the sort of thing you can imagine because this was a political campaign. It's and civil servants do not get engaged in, and this was, and we were doing advertising in newspapers. You might remember it. Every local newspaper for weeks had full-page adverts paid by the British state. And this was, as I say, Jeremy was very, very worried about this all the way through. And at the same time, we had Bernard Jenkins of fond memory on the Public Administration Constitutional Affairs Committee coming at us from the other direction because he was worried that the state getting involved in this campaign would set a precedent for an EU referendum campaign. So they were teasing away at this. And so we were sort of under that sort of twin pressure. Anyway, we did what we did and we got away with it.
I'm sorry, I'm using my opportunities as the chair to do this. Do you feel that impacted them when it came to the Brexit referendum? Like how the British state responds to the Brexit?
Yeah, I think so. If you remember, some of you will remember that in the EU referendum campaign, you got a door drop from. So there was some superficial learning, I'll put it like that. So they worked out, we'd done the household door drop, so they did that thing during the EU campaign, but it was that deeper learning. It was that, I think the heart of this was the failure of the state, and I include myself in this, not to understand the nature of the populist insurgency that the country was facing. And do you remember, Dino, the way that David Cameron talked about UKIP and the sort of loons and fruit? People didn't see what was coming. And I think if we'd looked at it, well, why did people in Scotland, people who voted Labour, whose ancestors would have turned in the grave that thought they were voting for SNP? You'll remember.
Yeah, massively.
Why were they voting for independence? It was like, well, things couldn't get any worse. And that sort of trope was something that underpinned what's going on in the Brexit time as well. And a more aware state, civil service included, and political class, would have seen that happening in the Scottish context and thought, do you know what? Should we even attempt an EU referendum? Because we might get blown away by that. And that failure is, I think, an absolute critical swivel point in the history of this country. And as my talk suggests, I think the lessons from the Scottish, even in its own terms, have sort of been forgotten already. And we maybe talk about this a bit more, but if you think the apparatus of the state to put the footing of the union on a different basis, to say that people in Scotland, those who even follow this will know that the opinion polls really haven't shifted
not at all since
2014. So I oversaw a process where they went from about 30% to 45%. And he went up to 50-odd%, over 50%. In COVID time, it's never really dropped that much below 45%. So this is extraordinary that we don't worry about this more. That nearly half the people in this not inconsiderable part of the UK think they want out of the UK. And yet the ability of the state to think through what it needs to do to get those people on side or back on side seems to be very limited. Just three very quick illustrations of that. In May 2015, I had a conversation with Jeremy Hayward and David Cameron about setting up something called the UK Governance Group, because my contention was you have to create something at the centre of the British state where you have you build up the capability and the capacity to understand these constitutional demolition issues. That group sort of exists in name still, but not. It has been there's been so many chops and changes since. It's sort of gone back pretty much, begging the pardon, one or two in the room, to where it was when I picked it up in 2012. Andrew Dunlop, who may well be listening on this one, who did a wonderful report for Theresa May, which was probably remember the Dunlop review, publication delayed by every year. His suggestion, one of his key suggestions, have a first Secretary of State who is responsible for being visibly at the centre of the government, that is drawing attention to these critical issues. I think the Gordon Brown Commission, which I was a walking part, his proposal about a Senate of the nations and the regions. Again, this is about securing where's that gone? It is not going to happen. So all of these things, these prompts into the system, this is what I mean about the failure of the state to be reflective, to learn, to make its own futures. It will remain reactive.
Thank you very much for that. It's very interesting. I could ask loads more questions, but I'm not going to use my own prerogative anymore. I'll open the floor to questions. I'm sure loads of you have some. And there's a roving mic. There.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. Just picking up on a point you made towards the end there. You said a bit about how sort of, my word, but casual or ad hoc the approach was to managing a lot of these things to do with the territorial constitution. And it occurs to me that that's a characteristic that is actually much more widespread in the UK government in terms of managing the constitution and dealing with constitutional change. I just wonder, from your vantage point, is that simply the way that played out in relation to Scotland? Is that simply a reflection of that broader tendency to treat the constitution with great casualness, or is it a particular problem, do you think, in relation to the territorial constitution?
I think there are two elements. One is the sort of what other people who studied this far longer than I did described as the benign neglect of the periphery, which you go back, if you think of Richard Roseworth, who studied this stuff, Jim Fulkett and so on. This is not me, sort of coming to this. This is a long strain of historiography on this, the way the British state has long dealt with the periphery. You go way back to 1797, and why did the Union happen? It was because of an existential threat, the succession, the potential alliance between Scotland and France and so on. The British state needed to react to secure its northern border, but it did so anyway. Once it done that, it sort of said, well, over to you guys. You just let go on with it. And that sort of attitude really has held ever since. And it's one of the things that I've had time out of Whitehall to reflect on is how deep these tropes go, how it's like soaked into the stones of the walls of the Cabinet Office and the older bits of Whitehall, that these actually don't change as they go very deep. But on the Constitution more generally, again, there's one or two in the room who sort of will have bounced their heads off this as much as I did in my time. It's just not like up there in Whitehall. The understanding of the Constitution is really thin. And I was astonished by this. But in my own career experience, I came into this in May 2012. I knew about Scotland because I worked there for 20 years. As I say, that was a bit serendipitous. But I wouldn't have described myself as a constitutional expert. And I was handed this sort of whole bag of constitutional issues, which I'd included in the referendum, which I had to sort out. But subsequent to that, if you scratch most civil servants, what training did you have in the way the British Constitution functions? The vast majority of them will have had maybe a wee sheep dip at some point not a sustained learning. And you ask the question, if the civil service doesn't understand this stuff, who the hell is going to understand it? And it really is extraordinary that we're in this situation. Now, there's lots of possible answers to that. I mean, my world, if I was running this world, which I never did again, but I would say that your gates into the civil service go via professional learning on the constitution, on how you manage money, law, and all the rest of it. And if you want to get to be in the senior civil service, you have to demonstrate some understanding of how Whitehall is seen from outside of Whitehall, either from the devolved parts of the UK, local government, whatever it is. Whitehall is too myopic, and its understanding of its own job is, as I say, the words I've used, it's unself-reflective. And I quoted you that thing of when, anyway, just to give you another one, Jeremy Hayward, when we went to brief him on function, Jeremy saying, this is going to be very dull. Thanks, Jeremy. You can see them all switching off. One time I went with Kieran Martin, who was one of the officials who was really instrumental in negotiating the Edinburgh Agreement. He and I were briefing this lot Wednesday morning colleagues. This is the Wednesday morning meeting of permanent secretaries, and we were going to brief them. So I wasn't going to that meeting on a regular basis. I was invited to come along to do this briefing, and I remember we were in 22 Whitehall because the normal room of the cabinet office was being refurbed. I remember sitting outside. We were on at 22:11. 22:11 came and went. 4:11, 10:11, 5:11, and they finished at 11. At 3 minutes to 11, we were invited in. And, we had a presentation and we could more or less just say, here's the paper. And as I was coming, I said, what were you discussing? This is in the height of a bloody referendum campaign. Oh, records management. And it sort of said it all. I can just do this alone. Sorry.
Oh, no, please do. It's great.
In Cabinet one time, when Michael Moore was Secretary of State for Scotland, it's the early days of the campaign. He was lined up to do a brief. It's all in my diary. I just remember, I've reread my diary, I remember this. He was due to talk about, to really G up Cabinet. Same thing happened. I used to sit at the back of Cabinet in those days, behind Nick Clegg. And the discussion prior to this went on and on and on. 2 minutes from the end of Cabinet. Mike, what's going on? And do you know what they were discussing before his item? The honour system. Sort of said to me where the priorities anyway.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. I think it really gives an insight into, I was going to say to the end, because that's the note I was making was, I think you should definitely think about publishing your diaries. How do you feel about that, guys? I think you have a few buyers here if you do that, Philip. Can we get some more questions? I'm going to take the opportunity for one down the front, and then there's another gentleman right back, or in the second one.
Philip, I agree with quite a lot of what you say about the civil service, although I wouldn't do some training for them in Whitehall. I'd make them all work somewhere else if they want to get promotion. I mean, that's what I'd do. But anyway, I suppose I've got a level of scepticism about some of what you're talking about, because your description of the state makes it sound sort of neutral, whereas I think a lot of the Scottish referendum and the way Cameron behaved was that it was about politics, and it was an arrogant conservative politician playing to the right wing of his party, and just assuming it was all going to be fine. And I think one of the problems, he said there wasn't much political engagement. Actually, my impression at the time from Alistair Donning in particular is the last people they wanted up were Tory ministers in Scotland. So, there was an overlay of politics that I think perhaps you're not describing sufficiently. I mean, I buy your stuff about the importance of understanding the Constitution and devolution, and that is still a problem. But, I don't think, for instance, a recommendation to have somebody, a first minister in London responsible for Scotland would ever actually work. I think it needs to be. I think we need a more sophisticated approach.
Yeah, there is a sort of a layer of this which I didn't go into any detail on, the interplay of politics. There was actually a really interesting intra-coalition dimension to this, and if there was a really interesting counterfactual. If in 2015 the Conservative won a majority Westminster, how would this have transpired? The fact, and there was when you looked at there was, I think Danny Alexander was one of the quad, Michael Moore, there were senior Lib Dem ministers who were intimately involved in this. And there was, I can remember the times when there was, but by and large, that unity held. But underneath that, when I was describing what was going to happen on further devolution, a rational state would have said, we build a proposition now, visibly. And they didn't do that because there was a political competition, and interestingly, there was a political competition that Labour was losing. There was a Lord Strathclyde led a commission which surprised everybody by being very front-footed on devolving further tax powers and welfare powers. Lib Dems were always in favour of sort of federal UK, and Labour was holding up was being dragged into this rather reluctantly. So there was undoubtedly throughout this there was a layer of politics going on, but sort of force majeure meant that David Cameron was not. He was quite astute on this, and to be fair to him, he recognised the Conservatives could not front this campaign in Scotland. But how did they let Labour lead all of that while still holding, keeping their own patch of ground clear? That's where English votes for English laws came from, because that was about conciliating English opinion. That was a worry about UKIP. And it was, so there was, of course, there was politics throughout all of this. And, there is a story to be told about that. When I talk about the British state, I am stepping, deliberately about the apparatus of the state, the interaction with the civil service and ministers, government in a relatively neutral sense. But of course, that is all interwoven on a day-to-day basis with pretty visceral politics.
I think we have another question, just this gentleman in the second row.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for the talk. It's really interesting. I don't mean to kind of keep making kind of parallels and comparisons between Brexit, but I think as you kind of insinuated in your talk, there are a lot. One of the mistakes that I feel that kind of David Cameron and the Remain campaign made in Brexit was that they were too kind of myopic and focused on London and the rest of the surrounding home counties, whereas a lot of my kind of northern relatives, who I think kind of all voted Leave, one of the reasons why they voted that way is because they felt like they were kind of abandoned by the Remain campaign, and they felt kind of forgotten. The Leave campaign latched onto that and focused their efforts up north. Do you feel like there were kind of similar mistakes made in the Scottish campaign? Because you mentioned about the leafy suburbs, and you knew that your kind of vote was going to be strong there, but maybe there was a bit of kind of anxiety around, say, the Highlands and those areas that weren't kind of being focused on. Do you think maybe in the Leave campaign, in the Brexit referendum, that just was kind of aggrandized a lot more, and that came to the fore a lot more?
There is parallel we've already touched on. Peter might have something to say about this as well. But the big shift in Scottish politics was not so much the Highlands or the North East or Perthshire, which was already pretty strong SNP. It was a sort of Tartan Tories who ought to have voted Tory, but there's farmers and fishermen who had for a long time. But that was where the SNP's heartland used to be.
And is again.
And this, yeah.
It's all they're left with
The
now.
big change was the Central Belt, and it was former Labour voters in particularly Glasgow and Dundee's not Central Belt, but Dundee as well, in the big cities. It was them switching, and these were people, as I said, who there's an interesting factor in all of this around the politics that's derived from people's background. There's a Protestant, the Catholic, all of that, which makes it slightly more complicated. But by and large, what we were seeing was former Labour voters saying exactly what you described, that we've been neglected, we're not being listened to anymore. And that's the learning that, because that was happening in the northeast of England, it was happening where you saw that big strong Brexit vote, a very similar sort of population, socioeconomically, saying the state has left us behind. In Scotland, they could latch on to this promise of a bright new dawn, that was the promise. This was going to transform lives. An extraordinarily powerful campaign, and they could latch on to that. And negatively, that was nothing. It couldn't get any worse. and would argue, of course, it could get a lot worse. But the other side of that coin was this promise of a brighter future where they would be listened to. And what you describe in your book about the way that this caught fire amongst a part of the population that had been politically disengaged. And in this part of Scotland, you know, it's the class that used to weigh the votes for Labour. Labour was so dominant at Westminster level and at local authority level. And it was that we saw changing and which pushed it really close. The turnout in Glasgow, I think, was about 75%.
Yes, I think 5%.
If that turnout had been like 85% at the national average, the result would probably have dipped.
So this has been absolutely fascinating. Okay, I'm going to take one last one because it's a hard stop in about 4 minutes. So I'm going to give you a very, very quick.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you, Philip, for taking us back 10 years to this important constitutional event. You made the point of how unprepared the government or the state was to deal with such a profound occurrence for the nation. I'm interested in your views of what would have happened had yes had a 51% win after the referendum.
Well, one of the things we were forbidden from doing was planning for a yes outcome. Prime Minister said, you do no planning, because his legitimate concern was that the UK government couldn't engage in doing down a part of its own territory. If you think about it, we would have been planning to negotiate with somewhere which is still partly because it would have been a bit weird. But the sort of more political reason was that if you plan for an outcome, like it sort of admits that you fear that outcome can happen. Anyway, when it got close to it, I had a conversation with Jeremy Hayward and said, you know, this is slightly in the balance now. We better at least know what we're going to do on day one. So there was this is in Sir Dan Hayward's book about Jeremy, that I and a few others were called into Jeremy's office, and we sort of knew that if it had been yes, the planes wouldn't have stopped flying. There would, you know, the Treasury would have handled the bank and so on. We knew what we were doing for the first sort of 48 hours. But it's a really interesting question. They would have almost by definition won by quite a narrow margin. I think one of the things that would have happened, and some UK politicians, Scottish UK politicians said this, so Scotland, I think, said at one point, if it's a yes outcome, my loyalty is to Scotland. I switch. I remember being in Aberdeen Airport when the UK Cabinet went up to Aberdeen, and the Scottish Cabinet had been in Aberdeen the same day, so there's a lot of milling around the airport, and somebody from one of the ministers in Scotland that I knew sidled up to me and didn't quite offer me a job in there, right new doors, but more or less said, you know, our doors open if it goes that way. So I think everybody assumes it would have been pretty fraught. It would have been immensely difficult. But I think there would have been a rallying round. And I think a lot of people who have been on the no side would have said, okay, the people have decided we will get stuck in behind that. There would have been a negotiation, of course, and there's a whole other story about what that would have looked like. But I remember saying to Jeremy in those meetings, when the folk, particularly from the Treasury, were sort of, we'll get them, you know, we'll get them. And I said, hang on, guys, I know that you hold pretty much all the cards. You, the UK, would hold pretty much all the cards. There's only two that the Scottish government have. One was Faslane, the nuclear base. The other was the share of the debt. Almost everything else the UK would be on the upper hand. But I said, you've got to think about what do you want to be happening on your northern border? Do you want a friendly state that's economically stable, that is locked into security and defence with remainder of the UK, is in NATO, or do you want a basket case on it which is unstable and all the rest of it? So I hope what would have happened is you'd have seen a combination of people in Scotland saying decisions been made, very close, not an ideal way to set off to become an independent nation. But I think you'd have seen a lot of rallying around. But even people like myself who lived in Scotland, we would have had to make that choice. Some would have left us. But I think the other thing, a wise UK government, and this is what I mean about not thinking ahead. A wise UK government would have thought itself into that space and worked out that the right thing to do would have been to run a long but a generous negotiation to keep Scotland upright, to manage a transition, and to have a neighbour on your northern border that was locked in a good way to common defence and security, trading relations, and the rest of it. So that's one of the great counterfactuals, and we won't know, at least for a while.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. We could do this for so much longer. It's been absolutely fantastic. I just want to say a huge thanks to Philip for an absolutely fascinating talk, fascinating Q&A. Huge thanks to Venue for hosting this McGrath Theatre. Thanks to the Bennett Institute. You can follow the Bennett Institute on social media. You can find out all about what's happening. And also some good news, we have a drinks reception after this. Even this Monday, we have a drinks reception. So hopefully you can stay and chat and talk more about it and everything else. And so just thank you, thanks again. And can I just ask everyone to put their hands together and say thank you. Thank you.